Persistence of predators. When you take Deathworlders children HFY sci-fi stories. The galaxy was vast, and it was home to many kinds of beings, some peaceful, some brutal, and others like the Deathworlders, a rare species known for their indomitable will to survive. The Deathworlders were feared throughout the stars. Their homeworlds were harsh, unforgiving, and teeming with deadly predators, but they had evolved and thrived. Their instincts honed to a razor's edge. They had learned to fight, adapt, and most of all, protect. But for all their strength, there was one thing that could break them: their children. It had started as a simple raid, an attack by a group of slavers looking to capitalize on the lucrative black market trade in young, rare species. The Deathworlders were not known for submitting to anyone, let alone traffickers. But these invaders were bold, armed with advanced technology and a ruthless drive. They landed on a remote colony of the Deathworlders, where the children were raised under the watchful eyes of their fierce parents. The invaders had underestimated the Deathworlders, especially their protective instincts. When the slavers stormed the village, they thought they would find helpless prey. They didn't expect the village's inhabitants to put up a fight, much less the wrath of a parent who would stop at nothing to retrieve their stolen children. As the slavers rounded up the children, a figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible in the thick, jungle-like underbrush of the colony. Her eyes gleamed with pure fury as she watched the slavers load her daughter into their ship, bound in chains. Nara, one of the fiercest warriors the Deathworlders had ever known, moved like a shadow. She was small by the standards of the invaders but possessed a strength and endurance that could bring even the most formidable predators of her homeworld to their knees. She had lived through the deadly jungles and survived the vicious creatures of her planet. No one was going to take her child. The slavers, unaware of the storm coming for them, continued their work, securing the captives on board their ship. The leader, a brutish figure named Kor, grinned as he turned to the rest of his crew. "These little beasts will fetch a high price at the auction," he said, wiping his hands on his pants. "We just have to make sure they don't destroy the ship before we get to the station." His words were cut short by the sudden explosion of gunfire from the treeline. The slavers turned, their weapons raised, but nothing could prepare them for the horrors that followed. A single figure stepped from the underbrush, her body taut with readiness, eyes flashing with cold determination. Nara had come, and she was a force of nature. The battle was brutal. The slavers' technology was advanced, their weapons lethal, but Nara had the element of surprise. She moved faster than they could react, her speed honed by years of surviving on a death world. Her agility allowed her to dodge blaster fire, and her strength made her a nightmare up close. Every slaver who came too close felt the sting of her blade or the force of her fists. They fell one by one. Kor, the leader, was the last to realize what was happening. By the time he raised his weapon to fire, Nara was already on him. She tore through his defenses like a predator toying with prey, disarming him with a fluid, practiced motion. In a flash, she had him on his knees, her blade pressed to his throat. "You took my daughter," Nara said, her voice a deadly whisper. "Now you will answer for it." Kor trembled, but he did not beg. Instead, he sneered. "You think you're the first to resist us? The first to fight back? You are nothing but animals." Her eyes flashed. "We are Deathworlders," she said, her voice filled with quiet fury. "We are the predators of this universe, and you are nothing but prey." With a swift motion, she ended him. The remaining slavers, now leaderless and terrified, tried to flee, but they had underestimated the wrath of a Deathworlder mother. Nara's people descended upon them like the predators they were, hunting down the remaining invaders with savage precision. One by one, the slavers fell, until only the children remained, safe, unscathed, and returned to the protective arms of their families. Nara stood among the ruins of the battle, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Her eyes scanned the field, taking in the bodies of the slavers and the grateful faces of her fellow Deathworlders. She had won, her daughter was safe. But deep inside, she knew this victory would not be the last. The galaxy was vast, and there were always predators who sought to take what was not theirs. And Deathworlders, above all, knew one thing: once you take a Deathworlder's child, you only make one mistake, taking them in the first place. The slavers had learned a harsh lesson that day. Deathworlders were not to be trifled with. They were the apex predators of the galaxy, and the price of their fury was always steep. Nara's people would go on, surviving, thriving, and protecting their own, for as long as there were those who would dare take their children. There would always be Deathworlders ready to remind them that in the grand scheme of the universe, it was the predators who ruled. Persistence of predators. When you take Deathworlders' children, HFY, Sci-Fi stories. Part 2, The Hunt Never Ends. Weeks had passed since the battle on the remote colony. The invaders, the slavers who had dared to take the Deathworlders' children, were now little more than a memory, their bodies scattered across the jungle where Nara had found them. The survivors, those few who had managed to flee the blood-soaked aftermath, had learned one irrefutable truth: when you anger a Deathworlder, you only provoke the relentless fury of their hunt. But the galaxy was vast, and predators were never without new prey. Nara stood in the heart of the jungle once more, her mind at ease, but her instincts still sharp. The calm after the storm was always fleeting, especially when dealing with those who underestimated her people. Her daughter, now safe in her arms, nestled close, sensing the quiet intensity in her mother's gaze. But Nara had trained herself to move beyond the immediate threat. She knew that this victory was temporary. There would be others, hunters, scavengers, or worse. As long as her people were alive, the danger would always lurk on the horizon. "You're safe now, little one," Nara whispered, her voice steady despite the weight of the past weeks. Her daughter, Lyra, smiled, but Nara saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It was the unspoken awareness that they lived in a world where danger was a constant. Deathworlders, after all, raised their children not only to survive but to be ready for the fight that might come at any moment. A deep hum suddenly reverberated through the air, and Nara's sharp eyes snapped toward the distant horizon. Something was wrong. The stars above flickered briefly, as though signaling a change in the cosmic winds. It wasn't just a feeling, Nara could sense it. Something was moving, something new. "Prepare yourself, Lyra," she said, her voice low, calm. "Stay close to me." Her daughter nodded, a growing fire in her eyes, a reflection of Nara's own resolve. They had survived, yes, but survival in this galaxy was never guaranteed. As the hum intensified, Nara activated her communication device. Her fingers danced over the controls. A series of short, precise commands. A connection buzzed into life. The face of a fellow warrior, Creel, appeared on the screen, his expression grim. "They've come," Creel said. His voice was clipped, urgent. Not slavers this time. Something worse. The Syndicate. Nara's blood ran cold. The Syndicate was a shadowy organization known for its vast reach and ruthless methods. They trafficked in more than slaves. They dealt in weapons, in biomodifications, in illegal technology, and in the destruction of entire species when it suited them, if they were after the Deathworlders' children. "The Syndicate? What do they want?" Nara demanded. Creel's eyes darkened. "They've set their sights on our people. They've heard the stories, the rumors, and now they want to see just how true the legends are. They want to capture the children, to study them, to weaponize our bloodlines." Nara clenched her fists, her muscles tensed, and every inch of her screamed for action. "I'll make sure they never get the chance." Before Creel could respond, Nara shut the communication device down. She turned to Lyra, her voice soft but resolute. "Stay with the others. Don't move until I return." Lyra's eyes were wide, her lips trembling, but she didn't argue. Nara had trained her well. She knew what was at stake. With a final glance at her daughter, Nara disappeared into the thick jungle, her form blending with the shadows as she became one with the night. The Syndicate's forces had already landed. Several large, heavily armored ships were visible on the horizon. Nara's sharp eyes watched them from a hidden vantage point high in the trees, her senses alive to every detail. The Syndicate had come in force, clearly underestimating the world they were on. They thought the Deathworlders' defenses were primitive, but Nara knew better. Her people had lived for centuries on a world where survival was a daily fight against the planet's myriad dangers. The Syndicate would soon learn that the true predators were not the ones they'd brought with them, but the ones they had come to capture. Nara surveyed their movements, watching the crew as they unloaded equipment and began setting up containment units, sophisticated devices meant to hold living creatures. Nara's lips curled into a grim smile. They had no idea what was coming. In the dead of night, the Deathworlders struck. They came like the hunters they were, swift and deadly. Nara led the charge, her senses primed, her blade flashing in the moonlight. The Syndicate soldiers, confident in their technology, were caught completely off guard. They were not ready for the ferocity of an enemy that had adapted to survive in a world where every creature was a threat. Nara moved through the chaos, her movements a blur. She took down one soldier with a single strike, his weapon falling to the ground before he even had time to scream. Another came at her with a stun gun, but she was faster, dodging the blast and snapping his neck with a swift twist. The Syndicate soldiers tried to regroup, but they couldn't anticipate the Deathworlders' tactics. They were isolated, each fighting like a single, coordinated unit. No one was left to watch the others' backs. Nara's eyes burned with relentless fury. She wasn't just protecting her people, she was defending her way of life, her planet, her bloodline, the children. Finally, after hours of battle, the Syndicate's forces had been decimated. The survivors were either dead or running for their lives, their mission a failure. Nara stood in the center of the wreckage, her chest heaving with the effort. The Syndicate would not return, not after today. But as she scanned the horizon, her resolve hardened. The galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, and if they came again, if they ever dared try to take the Deathworlders' children again, she would be ready. She would always be ready. For there was one thing the universe had learned by now: Deathworlders never forget, and the hunt never ends. And so, the legend of the Deathworlders lived on, carried in the hearts of their children and the fierce protectors who would never allow their legacy to be stolen. Persistence of Predators. When you take Deathworlders' children, HFY, Sci-Fi stories. Part 3, The Predator's Blood. The Syndicate's failed attempt to capture the Deathworlders' children had sent a ripple through the galaxy. But despite the fire that had burned through their ranks, there was something far worse on the horizon, an enemy more insidious, more patient than the Slavers or the Syndicate. The galactic warlords had become aware of the Deathworlders' tenacity, and they began to see the potential of their children, their bloodlines, as something to be exploited. What they didn't realize, however, was that in underestimating the Deathworlders, they had invited their wrath. Nara stood at the edge of a cliff. The vast expanse of her homeworld stretched before her. The deep jungles of the planet were thick with fog, but in the distance, a fiery orange glow lit the sky, where the first signs of a new threat emerged. A holographic message flickered to life in the air beside her, Creel's grizzled face appearing with urgency. Nara, there's word from the Outer Rim. The warlords are moving, on a scale we haven't seen. They've rallied a new coalition. They want the children, and they will not stop until they've wiped us out. Nara's hand gripped the hilt of her blade, the familiar weight grounding her. They think we're an easy target, she growled. They think they can break us. They're wrong, Creel replied, his voice dark. But we need to act. If they get any closer to the heart of our colonies, we won't have time to fight back. Then we won't give them the chance. Gather the warriors. We're going hunting. The Deathworlders had always been solitary in their survival, fiercely independent, trained to protect their own. But they had also learned long ago that unity was their greatest strength. Nara's call to arms rallied the tribes, each one sending their finest warriors to join her cause. Their goal was clear: the warlords were to be hunted down before they could bring their war to the heart of the Deathworlders. The plan was ruthless and precise. The Deathworlders would track the warlord coalition across the stars, drawing them into a web of deception and ambushes, never letting them rest. Nara had learned much during her life, and one truth stood above all else: predators were not just those who struck first, they were those who knew how to wait, to move without leaving a trace, to strike with the precision of a predator on its hunt. The first clash came on the barren moon of Threx, a desolate rock orbiting a dying star. Nara and her warriors had anticipated the warlords' movements, predicting the location of their encampment through sheer instinct and knowledge of their foes' patterns. They arrived under the cover of the moon's rocky terrain, waiting as the warlords' heavily armored ships landed, their massive engines kicking up dust in their wake. The warlords, armed to the teeth and smug in their arrogance, believed the Deathworlders were a fading threat. They didn't realize they were stepping right into the jaws of a predator's trap. With a single signal, the Deathworlders exploded from the shadows, descending like a storm of vengeance. The warlord soldiers scrambled to form a defense, but it was too late. Nara was already there, her blade cutting through the air with devastating accuracy. her warriors following in her wake. Each strike was methodical, designed to incapacitate rather than kill, at least. At first, the warlords' soldiers fought back, but they had no chance. They were not used to this kind of warfare, the kind where the enemy was invisible until it was far too late. Nara's warriors moved like shadows, striking from above, from below, and from within the very rocks of the moon. They left no room for error. Within hours, the warlords' forces were broken, scattered across the desolate landscape, their equipment destroyed, their morale shattered. But Nara knew that this victory was just the beginning. The warlords were not easily deterred. This battle would bring their wrath down upon the Deathworlders in a way they hadn't yet experienced. As the Deathworlders made their way back to their hidden base, Nara felt an eerie silence in the air. The hunt had begun, but so too had the war. She glanced at the horizon, the stars beyond beckoning. The warlords would retaliate, and it wouldn't be long before their ships appeared in the skies above her homeworld. Her mind raced. There was no room for hesitation. Her people would need more than just brute strength. They needed to become something more dangerous than the warlords could ever imagine. Back on the planet's surface, Nara gathered her closest allies. The time for individual battles was over. They needed to hit the warlords where it hurt, to make them feel the true fury of the Deathworlders. "We are not just survivors," Nara said, her voice cold and unwavering. "We are the apex predators of this galaxy. They've come for our children, our blood. They think they can use us, break us, exploit us, but they will learn the truth of it. When you take a Deathworlder's child, you wake something far darker, and I will make them regret ever underestimating us." The warriors around her nodded, their eyes burning with the same fire. They had fought for their lives. Now they would fight for their legacy. The warlords, desperate to recoup their losses, sent their finest bounty hunters and mercenaries to track down the Deathworlders. But the Deathworlders were never easy to find. They had become more than just fighters. They had become hunters, an unstoppable force stalking their prey from the shadows. And as the warlords' ships descended on Nara's homeworld, they would learn the most terrifying truth of all: a Deathworlder never forgets. And the hunt, it never ends. The galaxy would tremble as the Deathworlders began their pursuit, their relentless fury matched only by their determination to protect their children. The warlords would soon understand that taking a Deathworlder's child wasn't an act of conquest, it was a death sentence. Nara's resolve hardened. There was no escape from the hunt, and no one would be left standing once the Deathworlders were finished. As the first warlord ships descended on the Deathworlders' hidden base, Nara's voice rang out across the calm channels, as cold and unforgiving as the planet itself. "Let the hunt begin." The Predator's blood was in the air, and the galaxy would never be the same again.